Thank you very much, Zohar. Hello to everybody. As Zohar mentioned, my name is Sam Grundwerg. I'm World Chairman of Keren Hayesod, and I'm very pleased to be joined here today, this morning in Israel, afternoon for some of you, but all of you for our very first InterConnection webinar. And it's an honor to open today's discussion and to have participants from all over the globe. We have hundreds of participants from tens of countries, and it's really very exciting. It's great to have all of you. This was an initiative that was first discussed in Keren Hayesod before the coronavirus crisis began. Our goal was and still is to connect with the organization's young leadership all over the world. Despite the difficult times we're facing, we thought now would be an appropriate and still good opportunity to launch this series and to bring you quality and engaging content that you can take part in no matter where you are in the world and from the comfort of your home. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Keren Hayesod is a national institution that has been around for 100 years, connecting the Jewish communities all over the world with Israel, raising funds, establishing and supporting projects for Israeli society. We're very proud and honored to host for this first webinar series Micha Goodman, who is a leading voice in the Jewish and Israeli world and an accomplished author. Micha holds a PhD in Jewish thought. He's the author of several Israeli bestsellers. To just name a few: Moses' Final Speech, The Dream of the Kuzari, The Secrets of the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides, and the Book That Changed Judaism, The Wandering Jew, Israel and the Search for Jewish Identity. And of course, his 2017 book, Catch 67, which also rose to the bestseller list. I don't want to take up any more time from Micha, so I will turn it over to him. And I hope that all of you find today's lecture enriching and interesting. And I invite you and encourage you to join us for the upcoming sessions in our series. Be healthy and safe. I'm going to turn it over to Micha now.
Shalom to everyone. The other day, my wife and I and some friends on a shared community Zoom, we were trying to have a conversation about different issues, and we always channeled back to Corona, into the virus, into our anxieties, and what's going to happen, what's going to happen with the economy, what's going to happen to our parents, to our grandparents. And it was very hard to change the topic. It was very hard not to speak about Corona. Well, my friends, I'm glad you're all here. A lot of people from all over the world. I'm honored to open this series. And I want not to speak about Corona. Let's for 1 minute not speak about the virus, the crisis, but about an issue that was on our mind for a very long time. And believe me, it will be on our mind again. And I think this is the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think this is a very good opportunity to discuss this issue. I'll tell you why. Because when this virus ends, and it will end, when this crisis is over, and it will be over, so we'll be in a different world. The world as we know it, our familiar world, won't really exist, and there'll be another world on the other side of Corona. And I read this interesting theory in The Atlantic, also in the Politico, the past few days. This article was published. It describes a theory that, historically speaking, when societies go through a crisis, after the crisis, they're almost always more innovative and more open-minded. This makes sense because when a crisis happens, after crisis, people are willing to change. People don't recognize who they were before the crisis, so now they're open to be someone else, to try something else, to go on a different path. So on the other side of Corona, whenever this will be, 3 months or a year and a half, whenever this will be, people will be very open-minded. And I think that this is the time to think about different ideas. Because on the other side of Corona, we'll have to be there with better ideas of how to deal with the world, how to deal with Judaism, how to deal with Israel, and how to deal with the conflict. The conflict is waiting for us to deal with. What I'd like to share today is some thoughts about the conflict. Hopefully, we could use these thoughts and some of these insights on the other side of Corona, when the world would be more open-minded than ever to think about issues in a different way. So again, thank you for joining me today. Thank you, Keren Hayesod, for inviting me to open this series. And what I'd like to do in the short amount of time I have, and there'll be some Q&A, is the following: to share a brief history of the way Israelis understand the conflict. Then I'll try to understand how can we understand the conflict from a different angle today. So after the Six-Day War, that was a moment where two ideas were born. They actually weren't born. I describe this more in my book in Cash 67. They're very empowered. One idea is sounds like this: people woke up the day after the war. Now, when I mean the day after the war, I don't mean this literally. I mean this metaphorically. When I was working on my book Cash 67, I've learned that in Israel there's an interesting saying that the seventh day of the Six-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. I'll say that again. The seventh day of the Six-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. That's an attempt to say that in some way we're always a day after that war. I'm pretty sure we'll be saying the same thing about Corona, but let's put that aside. I promise not to say the C word. So the seventh day of the Six-Day War has been lasting for 53 years, which means, and the metaphoric day after, some Israelis, some Jews woke up, looked around, said to themselves, this is an amazing opportunity. And here's the opportunity. The opportunity is that the Golan Heights is land that the Syrians used to have, and now we have it. Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, it's land that the Jordanians used to have. They want it back, and we have it. Sinai Peninsula, they want it back. We have it. Gaza, probably not the Gaza Strip, but Sinai Peninsula, they want it back. For the first time in Israeli history, we have something we've never had before, and that is bargaining chips. We have something that they want. And this means that if we play our diplomatic cards right, we could reach a deal that will transform Israeli history. We'll give this land to the Arab countries towards peace, and that will transform Israeli history. Finally, for the first time in Israeli history, we'll stop being what Dayan called Medinat Mivtzar, a fortress state. A fortress. Like, think about Masada, how it's separate from its area. Israel is a fortress in the Middle East. It's a part of the Middle East, but it's not an organic part of the Middle East. So we'll finally be a part of the Middle East, and when that happens, European countries will really accept us. We'll finally be a part of family of nations, and the experience of being isolated as Jews in history will end, which means the opportunity that the Six-Day War presented is not only to bring peace, but to transform Jewish history and to end Jewish isolation. That's an exciting vision. But the peaceniks are not the only ones that woke up in the day after, in the metaphoric seventh day of the Six-Day War. There were some other people that woke up, and they looked around and they saw this that is now in Israel's hands. And they didn't see diplomatic assets. They didn't see bargaining chips. They saw Bet El, and it reminded them of Yaakov Avinu, of Jacob. And they saw Hebron, and it reminded them of Abraham, and actually all the patriarchs and the matriarchs. They saw Bethlehem, and Jerusalem, which is David and Solomon, and Shiloh. They looked around and they saw the Bible. They didn't see an opportunity to connect Israel to the world. They saw an opportunity to connect Jews to themselves, to their identities, to their past. And there was a theory here, a Messianic theory. And it goes like this. The greatest articulator of this theory is the son of the great Rav Kook, his also named Rav Tzvi Yehuda, also Kook. And this was the theory. In the Bible, there's chapters that describe that one day the people of Israel will return to the land of Israel, specifically mentioning the hills of Yehuda v'Shomron, Odi Shama Beharei Yehuda, specifically mentioning the hills of Judea and in Amos and Hoshea of Samaria. What happens if we actually do it? What happens if we start building homes in Judea and Samaria? So here's what happens. You're not only fulfilling a mitzvah, you're fulfilling a prophecy. And what happens when you fulfill a prophecy? When you're making an ancient prophecy a current reality, you are triggering the next prophetic chapter to become a reality. And then the next one will become a reality. So by building homes in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, you're triggering a chain of cause and events that will lead to Mashiach, to redemption. So here you have two ideas, two theories, two exciting theories born after the 6-Day War: peace and land. One camp said, if we settle the West Bank, Jews will connect to their past, and that will transform the future. Another camp said, if we leave the West Bank, Jews will connect to humanity, and that will transform the future. Both believed that the victory in war was an opportunity. Both believed that if we leveraged the victory, we could transform Jewish history. Both of these utopias had the belief that pretty soon most Israelis will see the light and join their ideology, their movement, their camp. Oh, and there's one more thing they both have in common, and that is that they were both wrong. They were both wrong. Because you see, what really happened in the past 52, 53 years is that most Israelis turned their backs to both ideologies. Today, most Israelis, if you'll, when Corona ends, walk down Emek Rafaim in Jerusalem, bump into an Israeli, ask him or her, hey, do you think that peace is around the corner and all we need to do is leave Judea and Samaria and we'll have peace? No matter who that Israeli is, 95% of the times, they'll think you're very weird for saying that and thinking that. And if you ask the same Israeli, yes, do you think by settling the West Bank we're transforming Jewish history and paving the way for the Messiah? They'll think you're on something. These two things now sound like weird fantasies. Both ideas born after the war started collapsing. And one of the reasons why they're collapsing has everything to do, as my friend Yossi Klein Halevi points out in his book Like Dreamers, his great book Like Dreamers, has to do with the impact of the first Intifada on national psyche and the second Intifada on our national psyche. Very briefly, the first Intifada was a blow for the Messianic right. And the second Intifada, and I'm choosing my words carefully now, was a fatal blow for the Messianic utopian left. Let me explain this statement. Just to make clear, I'm describing now not Israeli political history, I'm describing the history of two ideas. I believe that ideas, like people, have biographies. And they're interesting biographies. You have twists and turns, and these two ideas, land and peace, that were born after 67, now hit their first crisis in the first Intifada and the second Intifada. So very briefly, the first Intifada in Arabic means shaking off. It's a very powerful metaphor, image. It's one nation shaking off the control of another nation, shaking off Israeli occupation. What's the image of the first Intifada? A 10-year-old Palestinian kid holding a rock. And on the other side of that image, you have a soldier with a gun. That's obviously a troubling image for many Israelis and many Jews and many people. But it's specifically troubling in light of the 6-Day War. Because our prior to the 6-Day War is that a small, tiny country defeats 3 armies in 6 days. Those armies backed by the Soviet Empire. We were David. They were Goliath. Now we look at that image coming out of the first Intifada of a 10-year-old Palestinian, the other side is soldier, and you realize that maybe it's reversed now, which means when we conquered the land, we were David. Now that we are holding on to that same land, we are now Goliath. That image was very troubling for many people, many Jews around the world, many Israelis. When I speak about this abroad, and now in Israel, I speak about this abroad. So it's hard to explain to people what miluim means, what serving in miluim, in reserve, doing reserve duty means. You're a 32-year-old accountant, have a wife, 3 kids, mortgage, job, and suddenly you're taken out of your ordinary life. You put on uniform and you go chase 10-year-old kids in Shechem, in Nablus. And people came back shocked. And they all said something very similar. We didn't sign up for this. We're patriots, we're Zionists, we love our country. We didn't sign up for this. We signed up to protect our nation, not to control a different nation. Now, this collective assumption, awakening, we didn't sign up for this, has numbers attached to it. And here are the numbers. In 87, in the beginning of the first Intifada, only 20% of Israelis are for an independent Palestinian state. Fast forward 5.5 years later, into close to 93, now 70% of Israelis are for withdrawal from the West Bank and the formation of an independent Palestinian state. 20% to 70%. That's the first Intifada. That's the moment where Israeli says, we don't want to control Palestinians. That's not what we signed up for. I'm skipping now to the end of 2000. That's September 2000, second Intifada breaks out. There's already memories that are more fresh. Second Intifada breaks out, and it has a different quality, a different flavor. The image of the second Intifada is not of a 10-year-old Palestinian holding a rock. What's the picture that captures the second Intifada? How does it look like? Well, it's not a Palestinian holding a rock, it's a suicide bomber. Because the second Intifada was not about throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails and soldiers. It's about buses exploding and shopping malls exploding, and Israelis were terrorized because that's the real point of terrorism, not to injure Israelis physically, but to scare them, to damage them psychologically. Yeah, I know we're all thinking about Corona, but let's focus on this. Damage them psychologically, and that's terrorism. It's a very leveraged act. The physical damage is limited. The emotional damage is almost unlimited. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered in the second Intifada, but 7 million Israelis were terrified. Yeah, I know. Restaurants were empty, buses were empty. I know how this sounds. So, and that's the effect of terror, being terrified, of being psychologically limited. What terrorism does, it hijacks our imagination. So, but that's not the reason why the second Intifada was such a fatal blow for the myth of peace and for the romantic Messianic left. The deeper reason why it was such a fatal blow wasn't because of how bloody it was and how scary it was. It's mainly because of the timing of the second Intifada. What was the timing of the second Intifada? Well, 2 months after the conference in Camp David. You see, in the summer, July, August, Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, they go to a conference in Camp David. And in this conference, Ehud Barak made Yasser Arafat an offer that Bill Clinton wrote in his autobiography, My Life. They thought this is the most generous offer an Israeli leader would ever offer a Palestinian leader. Not that he was wrong, Olmert offered more, but it doesn't matter. At that moment, Clinton was shocked. And again, I'm not discussing now political history, but history of ideas. What's important is how Israelis experienced what happened in Camp David. And here's how Israelis experienced that Barak offered Arafat everything. Complete withdrawal from Gaza, almost complete withdrawal from the West Bank, partition of Jerusalem, and a compromise on Haram el-Sharif, Har HaBayit, Temple Mount. Wow. Israelis were shocked. Dennis Ross writes that this is the most generous offer. Shlomo Ben Ami writes the same. This became what's known as the classic Orthodox narrative of what happened in Camp David. There are other narratives today, but it doesn't matter. For Israelis, that's what happened. And the meaning is that when Israelis were asked, if you ask an Israeli in the middle of the second Intifada, when buses were exploding and people were terrified, and you would say to them, you know, all this violence is a result of the occupation, that would sound ridiculous. And that narrative, the classic narrative of the left, was rejected. Because Israelis couldn't accept the fact that all this violence is a result of the occupation, because all this violence began 1 minute after we offered to end the occupation. So the timing of the second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli left. By the way, the Israeli left has never recovered from that blow. Okay, let me pause for a minute and see what we've established so far. After the Six-Day War, two ideas are born, excited, realizing that by leveraging victory, we could transform Jewish history. And both ideas are now starting to collapse. The first Intifada, the second Intifada. Where does that leave us? Well, there are Israelis that were not disenchanted from the idea of settlements and continuing to control Palestinians even after the first Intifada. And there are some Israelis, less, that believe that peace is possible even after the second Intifada. But most Israelis, graduates of two Intifadas, entered a world of perplexity, where this is what they feel like. This is what many of us feel like. We can't control Palestinians, therefore we can't stay in the West Bank. We're not sure we could trust them when there's a partner there, therefore we can't leave the West Bank. So what do? Well, that confusion is the new Israeli consensus. Israelis today don't agree on what we can do. We agree on what we can do. And paradoxically, we can't stay in the West Bank. We can't leave in the West Bank. That paradox is the new broad Israeli consensus. This is where, according to many polls, 70% of Israelis have two yearnings. They don't want to control Palestinians. They don't want to be threatened by Palestinians. They definitely don't. And that paralysis is the new Israeli condition. For the past 12 years, that's more or less where most Israelis are. So, where does this take us? This paralysis is not only a result of two intifadas and the collapse of two ideologies, it's also a result of the victory of two arguments. Now I'm entering the third part of this presentation. One argument is the argument of the right, and it's an argument that I'm sure many of you are very, very familiar with, but let me just make a very brief argument, okay? We'll present it very briefly. So, can I, Adina, have the map of Israel with the green line presented, so we could share something? Okay, this is, thank God for technology. So I want you to take a close look at this map. And let's see if I know how to draw something with this map. Okay.
I want to do, I will make it for you.
What?
Tell me where to point, I will point for you.
Okay, I want you to point to I want you to look at the map and notice how Israel looks like. In the south, it's relatively wide. Okay, in the south, is there a way for me to point out? Amihud, is there a way for me to point this out, or is this not possible technologically?
It's not possible technologically.
Oh, okay, fine. So if you look at the south, yeah, Israel's pretty wide. Up north, like to the north of Samaria, like between Haifa and the Golan Heights, right? So Israel is pretty wide. When I say wide, I mean not Australia wide, right? I mean Israel wide, okay? 80 kilometers, that's wide. But between the Samaria and the Mediterranean, look at that. That's very, very narrow. And how narrow? 11 miles narrow. And some point, yeah, that's exactly where the point is. Look how narrow it is. At Israel is very narrow at its center. Now, a second fact about Israel: where do most Israelis live? Well, most Israelis live somewhere Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, Givatayim, Chulon, Bat Yam, Rishon, Ra'anana, Herzliya, Kfar Saba. Yes. So between Hadera and Gdera, exactly where Amihud is describing it. Yes. That's where most Israeli lives. 60% of Israelis, 70% of the economy, 70% of the culture. So the center of Israelis decided, Ben Gurion didn't want it that way. Ben Gurion thought that Jews in Israel should spread out. He wanted us in the Galil and especially in the Negev, right? but we decided we want to be like very close to each other, claustrophobic, all scrunched, creating the highest concentration of population of Jews in the world in the Tel Aviv area between Gdera and Hadera. Now it's true, Israelis like to think there's many cities there. Givatayim and Ramat Gan are different cities. But that's just our egos. When you fly over, you mean just one large, concentrated, populated, claustrophobic metropolis. Yep, exactly. So you see the problem, these two facts. Israel is very narrow in the middle, and I don't know how to say Dafka in English. Dafka, where it's most narrow, that's where most Israelis live. Dafka is a word that I can't say precisely, but there's also something, an oomph to it. So precisely where it's most narrow, that's where most Israelis live. So I want to, now that I'm presenting the argument of the right, I want to, this is geography, now I want to move from geography to history. One historic fact is, I'll still need the map. I'm here, I'll still need the map. If you look at 1973, 6th of October, as you all know history, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 6th of October, on Yom Kippur, there was a surprise attack of the Syrian army and Egyptian army against Israel. Where the attack is from? The Golan Heights. You see the Golan Heights? And Sinai. We don't have all Sinai on the map, but you could see, from the Suez Canal. Yes. It took us about 48 hours to get our act together and to block the invasion of Syrians and Egyptians. Until we got our act together, they conquered roughly 15 miles. Okay? But they conquered about 15 miles, depends where, in the Golan Heights and in the Sinai Peninsula. Now here's a question, a great question that right-wingers like to ask. It's the best question the right knows how to ask. This is where geography meets history. And listen to this question. What would happen, what would have happened if, and now listen to this question carefully, if they would have attacked Israel like they attacked Israel in 73, meaning a surprise attack, but in the borders Israel had in 67. I'll say it again. What would happen if they attacked Israel like they attacked us in 73, but in the borders we had in 67? So they conquered 15 miles, not from the Golan Heights or from the Sinai Peninsula, but where? Bang. By the time we get our act together to stop the attack, where are they? They're in the Mediterranean. Which led many people, like Abba Evan says, these are borders that you can't defend. So that's where geography meets history, where the paradox that, or the problem that most Israelis live where it's most narrow meets the precedent of 1973. I'll fast forward for a minute to 2005. 2005, Israel leaves Gaza. And as you know, about a year and a half later, Hamas takes over Gaza, and then all the communities living about roughly 10, 15 miles from Gaza are under terror. As you know, Qassamim falling on them periodically. Here's a question. What would happen if Israel would leave Judea and Samaria, the West Bank? And if Otef Yehuda v'Shamron will look like Otef Aza, which means if the area surrounding 10, 50 miles of the West Bank will look like the area surrounding Gaza. The problem is there's 50,000 Israelis living in the area surrounding Gaza. Almost all Israelis are living in the area surrounding the West Bank. It's Tel Aviv, it's Modi'in, it's Jerusalem, it's the Balkan. That's Israel. So if you repeat the withdrawal from Gaza in the West Bank, you're not risking Israel's periphery, you're risking the center of Israel, the highest population in the world. So from 73, you learn that these borders are not protected from a surprise attack. From 2005, we learned that by doing this, you're exposing almost all Israelis. You're turning, to put it briefly, Tel Aviv into Sderot. And then there's 2011, and with this, I'll conclude the right, and I'll move to the argument of the left. 2011, Henry Kissinger, which is still alive and with it, and his last interview was in 2016. And he had an interview with Jeff Goldberg at the Atlantic magazine, and Jeff Goldberg asked him the following. He asked him, what do you think of the foundation of a Palestinian state? And Henry Kissinger says the following. Ever since 2011, there's an earthquake, a geopolitical earthquake in the Middle East, what we used to call the Arab Spring. And I think earthquake is a good metaphor. The Kissinger metaphor is a very good metaphor. And he says, in an earthquake, every building that's not stable collapses. In the Middle East, in this geopolitical earthquake, any country that's not stable collapsed. And that includes countries we thought were very stable. They have a pretty long political tradition, like Libya, Yemen, Syria, which is Gehenom. What's happening in Syria? It's Gehenom, it's hell. Syria, Iraq, which is torn into pieces. 2 revolutions in Egypt. So Kissinger asked the following question. Is this the time to create another new, brand new, fresh, fragile Arab nation state? Is this the right time? And one of the forces of chaos that tore Yemen apart and Syria apart and Iraq apart, will a new, weak Palestine survive these forces? And what happens if it won't? If it won't, you'll have chaos in the West Bank, a dysfunctioning state, a state that's not very sovereign. In the vacuum of sovereignty in the West Bank, will sovereignty. So I had this conversation with an Israeli intelligence officer, and he asked me, "Who do you think will enter the vacuum of sovereignty?" And I said, "ISIS," and he said, "Yes." I said, "Hamas." He said, "Obviously." I said, "Maybe Hezbollah." He said, "Yeah, some kind of a proxy of Iran. Maybe Putin will give it a shot." Yeah, and he said to me, "Micha, think of a cocktail of all those forces together in the West Bank, entering the vacuum of sovereignty created in the West Bank." I find this the most interesting, updated, sophisticated argument of the right today. Why? The old argument of the right, based on the precedent of 1973, is the following. A strong, armed Palestine will surprise us and defeat us. A strong Palestine will threaten us. That's the old argument. Well, the new argument, the Kissinger argument, not that a strong Palestine will threaten us, it's that a weak Palestine will threaten us. A dysfunctional Palestine will threaten us. Now, I have to admit, this argument is very, very persuasive. Okay, that was one argument. Now, I would like to change hats. And this is that argument is very persuasive. It persuades me, and it persuades most Israelis. But I want to now introduce another argument, the argument of the left. It's the following arguments. The argument of the left has 3 pieces to it. There's a moral piece, there's a diplomatic piece, and most importantly, there's a demographic piece. So again, very briefly, the moral piece is like this. Occupation is immoral, and I think it's immoral. Now, I know many people get turned off when I say occupation is immoral. So let me clarify what I mean when I say occupation. The land is not occupied. I try to prove this in my book, Catch 67. The land is not occupied, but the Palestinian people are occupied. You see, the right got it right regarding the land. The left got it right regarding the people. Can we realize that the Palestinians are occupied and the land isn't? That the world is very sophisticated, therefore we have to have a sophisticated approach towards it. What does it mean the Palestinians are occupied? Occupation is the following scenario, is the following situation where there's a military regime controlling a civilian population. And that military regime was not elected and not chosen by the civilian population. Isn't that what we have in the West Bank? Yeah, that's what we have. Palestinians are civilians controlled by a military regime that they did not elect, that they did not choose. That's occupation. Now, I just want to explain why the fact that it's not moral also means it's not Zionism. Because Zionism, one of the most important principles of Zionism is national liberty, liberation of nations. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson joins World War I with an important message that we're going to tear down all these empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and all the nations that they're controlling won't be shifted and moved to the control of a different empire. No, those nations will govern themselves. That's the great idea of World War I, where every nation has the right to govern itself and control its own destiny. I know one nation that enjoyed that idea. That's the Jews. That's when Zionism started growing as a result of the world recognizing that every nation has a right for a state. Jews are a nation, therefore Jews have a right for a state. So if one of the most fundamental principles of Zionism is national liberty, occupying the Palestinians, robbing another nation from its liberty is anti-Zionism. A Zionism that occupies is a contradiction in terms. Let me move to another argument. The diplomatic argument is an argument that's not so persuasive these days, is that if Israel continues having a military regime controlling a civilian population, Israel will become a pariah state, isolated in the world. I have a hard time defending that argument these days because of the amazing relationship that Prime Minister Netanyahu is formed with, Modi, India, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, so it doesn't seem like military regime over civilian population is isolating Israel in the world. It used to seem that way, probably not true anymore. But I'm pretty sure that it's isolating Israel from the Jewish world, especially young progressive Jews. It's isolating Israel, maybe not from the world, but it's creating a distance between Israel and large parts and important parts of the Jewish world.
Micha, sorry, we're going to have to move into Q&A in about 3 minutes.
Oh, I'm not even close to being done. Let me, okay, so let me, I'll need more. Can I have 8 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, because we're not, okay. So let me, I was more brief on the left and the right just because of this technical issue, not because this is not a thing. So the demographic issue is you all know if Israel continues to control the West Bank, 2.5 million Palestinians will eventually be a part of Israel. And then Israel, the Jews in Israel are not a solid, massive majority in Israel. And when Jews are not a massive majority in Israel, we're not really, Israel stops being the Jewish nation state. And that's the end of Zionism as we know it. So for all these three reasons, ethical, diplomatic, and especially demographic, Israel can't control the Palestinians and has to leave the West Bank. Okay, I find this argument very persuasive. Most Israelis find this argument very persuasive. What do you do now? I'm persuaded. I think that if Israel leaves the West Bank, it's risking its future. If Israel stays in the West Bank, it's risking its future. If Israel leaves the West Bank, it's risking its national security. If Israel stays in the West Bank, it's risking its national majority. So what do? This is the catch. It's a catch. It's not a catch-22. As you know, this is a catch-67. What do? Most Israelis share this confusion. And there's something I wanted to tell you all the many people that join us today about Israel. There's something you don't know about Israelis, about the psyche of Israelis when it comes to this issue. We lost our certainty. Yes, it's confusing that we're confused because Israelis always radiate this, toughness, and we know we are in the military and we know trust us because we are tough and Israelis and just trust me, I know, dog cat, I know. But even though Israelis radiate the sense of certainty, we lost our certainty. And we lost our certainty about the issue we always used to care about most. So this confusion is the new Israeli consensus. And I'm sure there's many questions. What do we do with this? I want to share that this confusion could lead to paralysis. Like you say, if we stay in the West Bank, we shouldn't do that. If we leave the West Bank, we shouldn't do that. So we're frozen and paralyzed. But I think the bigger question is, how do we move confusion into action? How do we tap in to this holy grail of Israeli politics, of Israeli psyche, where most Israelis agree about something, but it's a paradox, but they agree about it? And how do we channel that agreement into action? Or put it differently, how do we move from paralysis to pragmatism? So I think this is how we should be thinking about this. And now moving into the last part of this, and I know I don't have a lot of time, I'll present a quick thought and we'll open this up. When we think about how do we, there's two important shifts in our thinking that we have to go through. One, we have to give up the post-67 dreams, the dream of all the land is ours or ultimate peace in our times. Both dreams, we have to somehow get over them. And if we're willing to give up what Israelis call shalom ba'aretz and shlemut ha'aretz, complete peace in all the lands, we're willing to give up both ideas and move from ideology to pragmatism, which means for building an Israel that's a fulfillment of the dreams, or pragmatism, just to ask what works and will make reality better. If we're willing to move from utopia to pragmatism, so I think you might be open-minded to the following shift of thought. It's the following. Are we willing to think about the conflict in the following way? Imagine someone would say to you, crime is bad. I have a solution for crime. I have a way to end crime. And the public debate, the opponent is saying, you can't end crime. That's impossible. Let's just keep things the way they are. Obviously, those are not the two options, right? Ending crime or sustaining the status quo. Obviously, those are not the two options, right? Most people would say, we can't end crime, but also we shouldn't be passive and keep things the way they are. We should reduce crime. When it comes to car accidents, no one is saying, let's end car accidents on the one hand, and the opponent is not saying, let's not do anything about it. No, we ask how, we realize there'll always be car accidents. We ask, how can there be much less car accidents? Can we think this way about the conflict too? We're trapped now in a false dichotomy. One side is saying, we should end the conflict. The other side is saying, you can't end the conflict. So let's more or less keep things the way they are. On the one side, transformation of reality. On the other side, status quo. But obviously, this is a false dichotomy. If we were thinking about politics differently, like we think about car accidents or about crime, we would ask, how do we shrink the conflict? And that's, I think, shrinking the conflict will be the best formulation of how to capture the new, confused Israeli consensus. How does shrinking the conflict look like? The following. I'll put it out, and I'll open this up for questions. Let's think about occupation, military regime controlling civilian population as something quantitative. And let's think about the security of Israelis as something quantitative. And let's say the amount of occupation that Palestinians are suffering from, if we put it in numbers, we would say, let's say it's 80 points of occupation, okay? We would say, okay, they have to go through checkposts, they can't fly away easily, they don't have freedom of economy. We add it all up, yeah, they're suffering of level of 80 points of occupation, and Israelis are enjoying 80 points of security. Now, we always believe that there's a zero-sum game between occupation and security. This is also another false way of thinking, which means the more we control Palestinians, the more secure we are, the less we control them, the less secure we are. What if, I would tell you, what if there's a broad consensus among military community that it's possible to shrink occupation without shrinking security? Shrink occupation, let's say, to level of from 80 to 20, and security staying in the level of 80. If we could do that, would you buy that? Because if you would buy that, that wouldn't end the conflict. We would still have conflict. But it'll be a different conflict with less occupation, but without less security for Israelis. And I think that's the move we should be thinking about. And there are moves. I'm working on this. In the end of my book, Cast 67, I'm starting to debate this, but I have to discuss this. I wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine a few months ago called 8 Steps to Shrink the Conflict. How does it look like? Every one step shrinks occupation a bit without shrinking security. But that's one step. But the interesting thing is that the sum of small steps is a big step. And this is the kind of thinking I think we should start entering, debating, reflecting on. And when the world is on the other side of Corona, maybe it'll be open-minded to thinking differently about this. Not the status quo of the right, and not the utopia of the left. Not the end of conflict, not the managing the conflict, which means keeping things the way they are. Shrinking the conflict as a new paradigm that captures the broad, silent, unspoken, unverbalized Israeli consensus and moves it from paralysis to pragmatism. That was I would love to hear your questions.
Okay, we have a first question from Sarah, and it says, you are talking about a biography of ideas. How do you anticipate the future development of these ideas in light of demographic developments in the space between the Jordan and the sea?
Yes, so I have a feeling that Sarah asked this question early on in the game. I think I kind of answered it. How I answered the demographic issue. How the demographic issue really is pushing us to thinking that we can't stay for a long time in the West Bank, and therefore we have. On the other hand, if we leave the West Bank, we're threatening Israel. So I have a feeling that Sarah's question was addressed during the lecture. But let me just say, if it's possible, right now, let me address the demographic issue from a different point of view. Right now, Palestinian Authority is enjoying a certain level of autonomy, but it's a crippled autonomy, if we want to be honest. I'll tell you why. The Palestinian Authority, meaning areas A and B, for anyone who's acquainted with how Oslo looks like, is 164 or 7, I can't remember, 164 or 167 autonomous islands which are not connected to each other. So let's say you're a Palestinian in Ramallah. When you're in Ramallah, you're saying, wow, in Ramallah, the cops are Palestinian, the TV is Palestinian, the whole system is Palestinian. I don't feel occupation in Ramallah. My cousin in Nablus, a town north of Ramallah, also is not experiencing occupation, but Ramallah and Nablus are not connected to each other. When you leave Ramallah to drive to Nablus, you go through Area C, which is controlled by the Israeli army. There's checkposts, and so they're not connected to each other. They can't import and export freely. They can't fly abroad easily. It takes us 3 hours to get on a plane when we were flying. It takes them 24 hours because they have to go to the Allenby Bridge. They don't have freedom of economy. So let's say if autonomy is the number, so we would say if Azerbaijan in the time Union was like an autonomy, but only had, let's say, 4 points of autonomy, and let's say Australia, which is officially under the part of the British monarchy, but we all know that it's really it's not really, it's completely independent. So we would say Azerbaijan is 4% sovereignty, and Australia 99.9% sovereignty. In between where we put Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, I would say 20%. What happens if we could take and empower the Palestinian Authority and its autonomy so it'll grow to 80%? Just enough authority and sovereignty for the 2.5 million Palestinians living there to be separate from Israel, but not enough sovereignty to enable them to threaten Israel. I think that's what we should stop speaking about, the amount of territory, and start speaking about the amount of sovereignty. Just enough sovereignty to be separate from Israel, but not enough to threaten Israel. That's a maneuver where you neutralize demographic threat without triggering a security threat. That's how pragmatic thinking should look like, and that's how we should start preparing for the day after Corona.
Okay, we have several more questions.
Yes.
The next one is from Alex. Can you also analyze the different approaches of the Palestinians regarding the conflict, something similar to what you did about Israeli society?
Yeah, so Alex, thank you so much for your question. This is, in my book, I didn't even make an attempt to analyze the different trends, different moves, different moods, different ideologies, different ideas in the Palestinian society. But ever since the book came out, I've been having a lot of interesting conversations. And there is something that I heard. I came and I lectured about this in the Israeli military to the, I would say, the top intelligence officers. And they said something to me that I kept hearing from Palestinians later on again and again. And it's the following. Also, the Palestinians are in a catch now. Also, the two great paradigms of the Palestinians have collapsed. For us, land collapsed, peace collapsed. For them, and again, I'm going to present now the Palestinian point of view. Many of you might not agree, but just remember, this is the Palestinian point of view, okay? The Palestinian point of view is like this. We had two paradigms, the Hamas paradigm and Fatah paradigm. Hamas paradigm was Mukawama. Mukawama is fighting Israel. liberation through fighting Israel. Fatah paradigm is liberation through negotiations and peace with Israel. I know many of you think they're not sincere, but that's how Palestinians see themselves, okay? And the way many young Palestinians see it today is that Hamas failed and Fatah failed. War failed and peace failed. Mukawama failed, look at Gaza. And attempts for peace through negotiations, a two-state solution, failed. Look at Abbas's regime is considered a very dysfunctional, unsuccessful regime among Palestinians. So very interesting. We had two paradigms, they both collapsed. They have two paradigms, they both collapsed. This is an opportunity. The fact that we both lost our certainty at the same time is an opportunity. It's an opportunity because maybe there's room for a new idea. And from many conversations I have with young grassroots Palestinians, they're starting to understand that we shouldn't try to make peace. They shouldn't try to make peace with Israel, but to start build their society bottom up, step by step. So what I call the small steps paradigm could be an Israeli idea, but it's also met with a Palestinian idea, and hopefully the catch. I call Israel has a catch 67, they have a catch 48, and their catch 48, where Mukawama fighting fails and the way they understand peace fails, maybe they'll also pave the way for a Palestinian brand of pragmatism.
We have time for just two more questions. The first one is, what can I do as an individual to help the situation? Do you think that grassroots efforts are effective in this situation? And it's from Mindy Davis.
Okay, Mandy, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I think grassroots is most important. I'll tell you why. I think grassroots is more effective than lobbying. I'll tell you why. New ideas will never come from politicians, not in the age of the politics of social media. Because the way politics works today, the way I understand it, is that politicians, a new idea always creates negative reactions from your base because people like the familiar. And today, with the great rule of politics is the politics of turnout, not the politics of persuasion. You win elections not by persuading people from the other side to vote for you, but from getting out their vote from your side. That's how politics works all over the world today. So people are just gonna, so the way politicians work today is that they try to understand what their base is really thinking about and to say it out loud stronger than them. And that's why politics is polarized all over the world, and that's why it's frozen and new ideas don't come out, because we want to satisfy your base. You'll never come out with something original, new, and unfamiliar, because people have natural reactions towards unfamiliar ideas. So where will new ideas come out from? From grassroots. And here's how political change does happen. A new idea is born, it becomes popular, and what's popular, when the idea becomes popular, politicians say, hey, I like that idea. And what they'll always say is, that was my idea to begin with. And that's fine. It was their idea to begin with. So politics are secondary users of ideas. Or as someone put it, politicians are passive smokers of ideas. An idea has to be born outside of politics, gain popularity outside of politics, and then it will be adopted by politicians. Let's say you're a lobbyist, and you want to persuade a politician to do this idea that I'm talking about. Let me tell you, I spoke to many Israeli politicians about this idea, and they love it. But if their base doesn't like it, why would they do it? You have to make it popular for them to adopt it. So yes, when it comes to new ideas in politics, grassroots movement works. When it comes to great ideas, it's persuasion of politicians is not the way to go, because politicians will never lead new ideas. They will join popular ideas.
Great. And the last question we have here is, how do the two theories presented reflect on Israeli elections?
Very, very good question. Yes, very good question. The Israeli elections were not about these ideas. The Israeli elections, what were they about? That's a very big question. And I would say it's a whole webinar. What were the Israeli elections about? But I understand there aren't many Americans here because of the time zone. It's right, if I understand correctly. But for Americans, this might sound familiar. In elections, not about an idea, but about a person, about the character, about what you think about a person. and that's the lowest level of politics. But I think actually in Israel, Bibi being the topic, the issue of the conversation is actually very deep. But this has to do with the fact, with something deeper happening in Israel. Let me just say this very, very briefly. In these days, there's two ways of thinking about politics. There's politics of policies and politics of identities. Politics as a policy is saying, hey, I believe I have a policy I want to promote. I'm asking what politician represents that policy, and I'll vote for him because I'm for the way he or she are thinking about the West Bank or about gay marriage or about church and state or about whatever is the policy I believe in. I'm searching for the policy, for the politician that's closest, that will promote those policies. That's one way. Politics of identity is different. I'm not voting to promote a policy. I'm voting to express my identity. And then I'm voting for the politician that represents my tribe. I'm voting for who I am, for my identity. Now, here's an interesting fact about Israel. According to many polls, when it comes to policies, Israelis are centrist, maybe a little bit center left. Like when it comes to territorial compromise, most Israelis are for territorial compromise. Not over Jerusalem, not over Temple Mount, but they are for, they're against like not 1 inch. Therefore, some flexibility when it comes to territory. Most Israelis are for larger degrees of separation between synagogue and state in Israel. So these are policies you could say they're a little bit center leaning left when it comes to the way Israelis think about policies. And by the way, this is not one poll. These are polls after polls after polls. When it comes to policies, most Israelis are center left. When it comes to identity, Israelis are asked to identify themselves. They're almost always identified as right-wingers. I'm a right-winger. I'm center, I'm right. So here's an interesting paradox of Israel. When it comes to identity, they're leaning to the right. When it comes to policy, they're leaning to the left, which means if elections are about identity, the right wins. And Bibi gets this. So he wants to make it always about identity. So it's about voting for your tribe. And making politics about tribes is the way politics in Israel is managed as we're talking. There's irony here, by the way. The politics of identity was invented by the left, and that's what's keeping Bibi in power. I hope that was helpful. Maybe one last question?
We are out of time.
Out of time, okay.
Thank you again for this lecture and for your time, and to everyone from around the world who joined in and for all of the questions that were asked. Our apologies for not being able to get to all of them, but this was really great. And next week on April 2nd, we have another webinar with Nadav Eyal, who is the Chief International Correspondent for Reshet News, and he will be talking about coronavirus and national security. So you can follow us on our Young Leadership Facebook page, where all of the next webinars will be posted. And also, for everyone's information, today's lecture will be posted on Keren Hayesod's website following the conclusion of today. So thank you, Micha, and thank you to everyone for joining in.